Hello, students, and welcome to the 2020 and 2021 school year. Today, we're going to start with Unit 2, Chapter 4, and we're talking about determining the credibility of sources. You may be wondering why we're starting with Chapter 4. The book starts, the first three chapters are basically about the end of course exam, which you'll take at the end of the year in American history for your credit toward graduation. The first part of the book just talks about taking that test, what that test is like, and so forth. We're going to be practicing ways to be successful on the test throughout the school year. So we're not going to cover those three chapters. So that's why we're starting with chapter 4. So we're talking about determining the credibility of sources. The first discussion is about a primary versus a secondary source. At some point in your schooling, you have no doubt discussed this topic. A primary source is an original record of an event. It can be an eyewitness report. It can be a record compiled at the time of the event, or it can be artifacts from an actual event. An eyewitness report would be like if a person witnessed Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation or Gettysburg Address, if they were there and witnessed it and wrote about it, that's a primary source. If you were not there, but you at the event, but you lived during the time of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and you collected newspaper articles about it, that would also be a primary source because it happened at the time of the event. If you were to have had Abraham Lincoln's handwritten copy of the Gettysburg Address, that is a primary source. That it would be an artifact from the actual event. A secondary source is a writing or interpretation that historians and other writers have made about events that occurred in the past. So they weren't there, they didn't see it happen, they didn't live at the time that it happened. However, they are writing about it based on information they have. Examples of secondary sources are textbooks, articles, and of course, Wikipedia. Now, beyond if it's a primary or secondary source, the important thing is it a credible source? Is it something that you can believe? The Think, Pair, Share video for this chapter talks about this. Credibility is whether or not a piece of information is believable. How do you know if it's credible? Number one is qualifications and reputation of the author. Does the author have a history of being very successful? Have they written other things? Do they have a good reputation? Or is it some kook that has no history and a bad reputation? Got to look at that. Does it agree with other credible sources? If it does, it's more credible. It's likely to be credible. If it doesn't, it's likely to be not a credible source. You also have to look at the perspective and bias of the author. Perspective is the position from which something is seen. Bias is prejudice held by the author. So if you are a Republican writing about the Democratic National Convention, which is going on right now in August of 2020, your perspective is that of a Republican, and you're probably going to be biased. You're going to be prejudiced. You're going to already have negative connotations about the Democrats, and vice versa. If you're a Democrat writing about the Republican convention, which will happen later this year, you're probably going to have some bias against the Republicans. So bias is something that you have to look out for. If there is bias, if you can tell the author is biased, in other words, they already lean toward one side or the other, that makes the piece of information less credible. You also need to look for stereotypes. Stereotypes are generalizations about a group um, in which a defined set of characteristics is assigned to that group. Uh, Around this area, of course, to use a familiar example, some people say, well, Kentuckians are hillbillies, or Kentuckians aren't very smart, or West Virginians aren't very smart. That would be a stereotype. It's a generalization about a group of people that is not true about the entire group, but they generalize it that way. You may have heard the stereotype that blondes aren't very smart. Things like that are stereotypes. If it includes that, you are not going to be able to trust that source. And this video is coming to an end, so I will have to close it out at this time and pick it up with video number 2.